Hey, you are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
You're listening to Rootbound. When you want to kick it rootbound.
I am out here in my garden, and I am looking at a very beautiful bumblebee that is flying around from red dead nettle to red dead nettle, collecting nectar and pollen. Do you guys remember red dead nettle from a previous episode of Rootbound? Well, my garden is full of it at the moment, really blooming good, and the bees of all kinds are really enjoying it. And that had me thinking today about pollen, and just considering pollen a bit more, and so I thought I would talk about pollen a bit today. And so for a reminder, pollen is essentially the sperm cells of plants. And in order for plants to reproduce, that pollen has to get from one plant to another, has to get from the male parts of a plant to the female parts of another plant in order to reproduce. And in order to do that, that's a little bit tricky because pollen has to move from one place to another, sometimes quite far. And in order to do that, there's actually two main types of pollen. There is anemophilous pollen and entomophilous pollen. And those two things mean wind-loving or insect-loving. So plants like the hazelnut we talked about in the same episode we talked about dead nettle is an anemophilous plant. The pollen is anemophilous, and that means that it spreads via the wind. Whereas red dead nettle, as you could tell by the insects I just am seeing all over it right now, is entomophilous, insect-loving, and the insects, the pollen sticks to the insects, and the insects help move the pollen from plant to plant. Another thing I was thinking about with pollen is why do we get allergies from pollen? It seems kind of interesting. I mean, it's just, plant pollen. It should be harmless. And so I was reading a little bit about that, and I guess it makes logical sense because pollen, we think about it as just this kind of dusty stuff. But if you look at it microscopically, they're little tiny living cells. And if these other foreign living cells get into your body, sometimes your immune system decides to be proactive and say, hey, I need to nip this in the bud. And even though it's harmless, I think sometimes your immune system is, not quite aware of that, and so it does what it can to rid yourself of these little foreign cells that have entered your body. So that makes sense. An interesting thing, though, that I learned is that we are mostly, and I think maybe in all cases, don't quote me on that, but in general, we are allergic to anemophilous plants that spread by the wind, because that's the pollen that gets everywhere. You're very unlikely to get pollen from an entomophilous plant in your nose or whatever, because that pollen is sticky. It's meant to stick to the legs of insects and not spread through the air, so it doesn't really get in your body the same way as anemophilous plants. So anyway, sitting here in my garden thinking about pollen, and let's maybe move on to our guest, who also has some interesting things to say about pollen.
The pollen grains, along with other allergenic materials, enter the bronchial passages and, falling on susceptible tissue, set in motion the allergic reaction. This causes inflammation, resulting in uncomfortable and potentially disabling constriction of the breathing passages.
Hey, Steve, how's it going?
It's good, Steve. How are you?
We have a double Steve episode today.
We do. Steve squared.
Indeed. Steve, do you have a plant to share with us today?
I do. It's a very fun plant. My plant today is skunk cabbage.
That sounds very fun. I don't think I know what that plant is.
Oh, it's a very common plant to the Northeast. It's one of those plants that you probably are not aware of unless you're out tramping around in wetlands and stream bottoms and all those wet forested areas that are common to the northeastern part of the United States.
Very interesting. So I'll probably have you describe it soon, but I'm curious why you chose such a plant, the skunk cabbage.
Well, one, its name, right? Skunk cabbage kind of is just one of those things that catches your eyes. It's neither a skunk nor a cabbage. It's definitely a plant. But the reason I chose it is ultimately, as a beekeeper myself, it's one of the earliest blooming plants that produces pollen that the bees utilize, amongst the other fascinating things that the plant does.
Oh, interesting. I'm, as many listeners of the show know, I'm also a beekeeper, but that's not one that I was aware of. So, I should be paying more attention to the skunk cabbage, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
it's one of those plants that again, it's in wet areas. Typically, you're not going to find them in your average backyard setting, or even urban suburban settings. It's on the fringes, typically in the wet areas, the margins of streams and lakes and wetlands and things along those lines.
yeah, interesting. Well, I do live in DC, which is quite a swampy area, so I probably could find it out here, I guess.
Could be.
Um, what does it look like?
Yeah, it's actually very plain, but it stands out. So certainly, as one of the first blooming plants in the springtime, it will stand out because everything's brown and dead in the spring, or late winter, and we don't get the color. So in the skunk cabbage, the flower itself is not really. A flower as we think of with petals and bright colors and things along those lines. It's a very drab plant. The flower itself is actually a dark purple or maroon color with some white or yellow spots or flecks on it. And then, of course, that's the what they call the spathe, and it's a more of a hood type of a leaf that curls up into a point, but inside that spathe is the actual what they call the spadix is the fleshy part of it. It's the flowery spike. It's a little golf ball shaped ball with a whole bunch of little flowers on it with no leaves, just little. Think of if you were to take a flower and you see the center of a flower where all the pollen is. Well, in the center of this skunk cabbage is this little golf ball shaped looking thing with all these little yellow pollen sources, and the pollen kind of falls off into the base of that flower, and then insects like your bees and flies and other early pollinators come out and utilize that pollen.
Really interesting. I think I think I know this, but I know some of my beekeeping knowledge kind of comes and goes. But maybe for the audience, why is it important to have pollen, and particularly early in the spring?
Yeah, for bees, especially honeybees, and us as beekeepers, it's been a long, cold winter for those bees. In some areas of the country are a little bit warmer than others, but as they get through the winter, they're starting to raise brood and young bees, and they need pollen as a protein source to raise that brood. So as they come out of winter, they're looking for the first available protein source that they can, and skunk cabbage is one of those. And there's certain attributes of skunk cabbage that allow it to be one of the first emerging pollen sources for those bees, which makes it very interesting.
Yeah, that is super interesting. I just Googled what it looks like. It looks pretty looks kind of alien. It's not what you expect as
Yeah,
a plant.
yeah, it's really not very colorful. It is unique in that it oftentimes it's blooming while there's often snow and ice on the ground, and that's one of the neat features of skunk cabbage is that it generates its own heat. So even when everything is frozen around it, that heat can warm up the area immediately around that flower up to about 70 degrees. So it melts the snow
Wow.
around that plant. So oftentimes, if you're out walking through wet areas and the edges of swampy ground, you'll see these little pockets of melted snow where the skunk cabbage is starting to emerge and heating up that area around the plant as it comes up. And then, of course, it's one of those plants that the flower comes out first, and then the flower goes away and it sprouts that cabbage-like leaf, right? It's these big green leaves that grow over the course of the spring and summer, and then it goes into dormition late summer, early fall, and the process starts all over again. So it's very neat as a plant, and that it generates that heat, and of course, per its name, if you were to ever break open a part of that flower, it to me it doesn't smell like skunk, but it does have that pungent decaying smell to it. It's just a strong, which is also unique to it because other animals won't eat it, right? Because of that pungent smell and its bitter taste that it has. So it's one of those plants that's very unique, kind of. It's in the same family of, like, I think it's the calla lilies, those
Mm-hmm.
types of flowers that big green plants, but the flower itself is small. Another one that people may be familiar with is Jack in the Pulpit, which is also a
Oh, okay. Yeah.
wetland native plant to the northeast. So it's that same family of plants, but that skunk cabbage, it's really neat to watch it. You'll actually see some insects gravitate to it because of the warmth that it generates, in addition to the pollen. It's just all those functions really just provide that first source of heat, pollen, everything for the insects that are coming out. So it's very fascinating.
That's really interesting. I was looking at my bees really early, like early February, and they were bringing in pollen super early, and I was like, what is this?" And I wonder if it was skunk cabbage because I was surprised.
Yeah, it's possible. You're several weeks south of me in terms
Mhm.
of climate and things along those lines. But yeah, I mean, there's very few plants that are blooming early, and when you look at the chronological time frame of plants blooming on the East Coast, for example, skunk cabbage comes out first, right about the same time. Witch hazel comes out, and witch hazel is a
Mm-hmm.
native and propagated shrub that you might find in suburban, urban, rural environments. And then you get into the maples and the willows and oaks and things like that. So yeah, it's very possible. I mean, you and I both know that honeybees can travel upwards of 2 or 3 miles to forage. Typically, not that far in the springtime, but yeah, if you have any type of wet stream near you, or wetlands, a stream, uh, swampland, something like that. And a lot of these places do have them. I mean, you look at some of the urban, suburban environments that are creating these retention ponds, right, to hold water at
Mm-hmm.
development.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times you'll find skunk cabbage starting to grow up in some of those as well. So it's very
That makes
possible. Yeah.
sense. We're pretty close to the Potomac here, and then there's also
Yeah.
a river called Hunting Creek
Hmm.
that is a offshoot of the Potomac, and there's a few other little offshoot streams and stuff. So
Yep.
I'm gonna have to pay attention to it. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I had not
check out the
heard of that before.
check out the wooded areas, like the
Uh
sparsely
huh.
wooded. They're typically not a wide open plant. They like some overstory to them. But yeah, I would be and the pollen itself is a very light yellow lemony, a light lemony color. I'm looking at my notepad that's sitting here. It's at 9.5 by 11 legal pad, and it's that real
Mm-hmm.
pale yellow color. That's kind of the color of the pollen, which is pretty interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I have to look. I think I think that's the pollen they're bringing in, and I was like, yeah, I was like, what is that?
Yep.
Because I think it was like before the maple, because I have a maple in my backyard, and
Yep.
I think I was actually still I haven't talked about this on the show yet, and I will at some point, but I was tapping my maple, so
Mm.
still didn't have the buds yet,
Yep.
and there wasn't anything else up. I mean, one of the first things that appears in my yard, which I talked about a few episodes ago, was dead nettle. Is
Yes.
a non-native, but that comes up super early. Um, but yeah, it was before that too. So yeah, that's cool. I'm gonna have to go look for it. I guess I wonder if I'm at the point where the flowers are starting to go away, in
Probably,
later in the
yeah.
spring here.
In
Yeah.
your area, that maybe you might still catch some because they all come up, over a course of several days and weeks. So it's that time frame of the weather that's changing. The other way you could find out too, besides the color of the pollen, is look at your bees that are coming in. They'll actually get pollen on their heads and their backs because of the way the spadix, that golf ball structure that's in the flower where the pollen is, as that pollen drops down into the base of it and the bees are in there rooting around, they get the pollen on their backs and they can't reach it. So you'll
Oh.
see the color on their legs, but you'll see these stripes down their back and on their head, which is from them digging around in that spadix bowl to get the pollen. So you can tell a lot just by observing what those bees are doing.
Very interesting. Do you have any other fun facts or dazzling details about skunk cabbage?
They don't have it in the South. Yeah,
Oh.
I was talking to
Oh.
a master beekeeper friend of mine down in Arkansas, and similar conversation about what
Mm.
the bees were doing, and he said, I've heard of it, but I don't think I've ever seen it." And he, quick Googled it and found out that they typically they don't get it down in Arkansas. In fact, down in the southern states, like you get into Tennessee and Kentucky. Um, they are actually considered endangered or threatened because it's the southern ends of its
Oh.
range. But yeah, that's basically North Carolina. That whole latitude is about as far south as they go, so they don't get it in Florida, Georgia, those southern states. But yeah, that's the neat thing too. Is it's really basically a northeastern type of a plant. They do have a western skunk cabbage as well over in Oregon and Washington, Alaska and those areas. But obviously, we're very familiar with it here in the Northeast. But yeah, it's a neat little plant that the name kind of doesn't want you to look. It makes you not want to look into
Yeah.
it. But
Yeah.
it certainly has its unique features.
Yeah, maybe you don't know the exact thing here. The thing that's most fascinating to me that you mentioned is that it generates heat. That's pretty cool. Do you know anything about that process?
What the heck is that called? Thermogenesis, I think is what it's called. Yeah, thermogenesis is, and it, it's able to create that heat and form that little pocket. And what it's amazing to me too is that 70-degree temperature. I mean,
Yeah, that's nice and warm.
it is, and I've seen it in flies and honeybees where it's 50 degrees. It's borderline for them to be flying, but because of that heat, they'll actually some of those, especially the flies and the carrion beetles and things like that, will sometimes spend the night in the flower because of the
Oh,
heat
wow.
that it does it. So, yeah, thermogenesis is what it's called, and I'm not sure what the actual chemical process is that causes it to create that heat, but there's no other plant like that I'm aware of. We're
Yeah,
all
I'm
waiting.
gonna have to look into that. That's super interesting.
Yeah.
You feel like you could, like, in an emergency, like, put your tent up around a few of those things
Yeah, it
and
makes you
warm yourself
wonder. Yeah,
up.
it makes you wonder for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
but again, yeah, that 70 degrees. I mean, the fact that it can melt ice and snow to create that little pocket of heat, to bloom before anything else blooms and attract the insects to it. I mean, that's essentially part of it, right? If I bloom first, I'm going to get pollinated before anything else does. So it's a
Yeah,
very,
that's really interesting.
it's
And also, like, that heat is also very advantageous. Like you said, on those insects, it's hard for them to do their work
right,
when it's colder,
right.
but yeah, you can borrow some
Yep.
heat from the plant. That's really,
And
really
and
fascinating.
and it tastes horrible, so nothing eats it. So it's a win-win all around.
If you are afflicted with melancholy at this season, go to the swamp and see the brave spears of skunk cabbage buds, already advanced towards a new year. There is no cant to them. They see over the brow of winter's hill. They see another summer ahead. Henry David Thoreau.
Well, do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this plant, you might know about this one, so humor me a little bit. You might know some of these details because you actually first introduced me to this plant.
Ooh.
At the community apiary in Pittsburgh. I didn't know about this plant before, but it is the Jerusalem artichoke, or also known the sunchoke.
Yes.
And as skunk cabbage, Jerusalem artichoke is neither from Jerusalem or an artichoke, and I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yep.
But the personal story is yeah, when I lived in Pittsburgh and we were, I was filming you for this documentary about bees that I made about you, so everyone should watch that. I'll link it in the show notes. Called Portrait of an Urban Beekeeper, starring Steve here, the master beekeeper of Pittsburgh. But there's a community apiary out there, and I was, filming out there and learning about bees, just starting my bee journey. And I was asking what these really tall flowers were that look like sunflowers, but the flowers are really tiny. And Steve was like, "Oh, those are Jerusalem artichokes, and you can dig up and eat the tuber." And I was like, "What? That's really interesting." And so I started Googling it, and I was like, "Oh, these are really cool plants." And so I asked you if I could harvest some in the fall, and you're like, "Yeah, go ahead." So I pulled up a couple, and I ate some, and then I planted some in the this little planter box in the house I was living in there. And I'm wondering, because what I know about them is that they don't go away now. I'm wondering if the people who live there now have been fighting these Jerusalem artichokes or enjoying them. But I'll get a little bit more into that. But yeah, they're a cool plant. And I might even have some questions for you because there's one little piece regarding that I'm not clear on. And I might speculate a little bit, but I'll ask you about it. But let's get into some of the basics of it. The Latin name is Helianthus tuberosus, which is Helianthus is a sunflower and tuberosus is tubers, though they're tuberous sunflower. And the sunchoke, or the Jerusalem artichoke we're talking about, is actually in the ground. It's like a little potato, or it looks a little bit like a ginger to me. So that's why they're tuberous sunflowers. Those tubers are edible, and I think they're quite tasty. And I've actually been growing them now myself for the last I think 3 years now. And they're a really cool plant to grow because they have just ridiculous yield. I think I've been growing them in a 4 foot by 4 foot little bed. And I got, last year I harvested 20 pounds of tubers from that 4 foot by 4 foot
Wow.
area. And I did a little bit of research. There's a book. I'm trying to find the name here. It's called Biology and Chemistry of the Jerusalem Artichoke. It's a pretty technical book, but in there's a little chart about different crops and their yield. And Jerusalem artichoke is apparently only second to corn for its kilocalories or calories per meter squared.
Mm-hmm.
And actually for kilogram yield, if you're talking about just pure like material, it actually seems to be the most productive crop. So this is showing 17,000 kilograms per hectare versus potatoes, which would be next in kilograms per hectare. So it's a really, really massively productive crop, but it's not used as much. And there might be a few reasons why. You might know some of those reasons. I'll get into those now. So the one thing that makes Jerusalem artichoke kind of unique, well, there's several things, but that tuber, it produces its carbohydrates in a chemical called inulin instead of starch.
Right.
Starches are based off of sucrose and glucose, but inulin is based off of fructose.
Right.
And the thing about inulin is that our enzymes in our stomach cannot digest inulin.
Mm-hmm.
But the bacteria in your gut, further down your digestive system, can. And so they say that sunchoke is actually really good for like gut health because it's a kind of like nutrient for like, those little bacteria in your gut that they don't kind of get this kind of food very often. But that can also lead to one of the other names of the Jerusalem artichoke is sometimes it's called the fartichoke because when you eat them sometimes, especially if you're not used to eating them and your gut bacteria start like getting very excited for this new source of material they don't normally get. Some people get like stomach discomfort.
Sure.
And over time, eating them, that kind of goes away. But some people have like really like terrible pain and think that it's some kind of like poisoning thing, but it's actually just like an increase in like the production of those little bacteria. And we talk a lot about gut health these days and like feeding your microbiome. And apparently sunchokes are really a great way to do that, but you might want to start slow if you're trying them.
Yep.
But now I eat them pretty regularly, and they're good.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say it's interesting with the fructose because tying it back to the honey too. Honey is made up of fructose and glucose, which is our simple sugars, and that makes it our stomachs are easier to digest stuff like that. So, and it's interesting that that's one of your favorite plants too, because my second favorite plant probably is Maximilian sunflower, which is a relative of Jerusalem artichoke. They're both in same type of family. The tubers, not as fat as your artichokes, and not the seeds aren't as the seeds are probably about the same size, but same type of family where it's that tuber growth rather than a root growth.
I don't know that one. That has tubers too. Maximilian sunflower.
Yep. Tubers and rhizomes, basically. So they can get out of hand too. So similar to you, I planted some, and that patch gets bigger and bigger because they put out the rhizomes, to spread, and then those grow bigger into, basically these little tubers. So it's a neat little plant. That's same thing. I think it's what is
they look? Yeah, they look very similar.
They're very similar. Yep.
I'm looking at them now.
Yep.
Yeah. Are the tubers also edible? Like the
yes.
Oh, interesting.
Yep, but I think the Jerusalem artichoke is a bigger tuber. I think it's more robust because that's more popular. The Maximilian sunflower is a native sunflower as well, and similar to your artichokes. You could however you want to bake them, cook them, fry them, saute them, all that fun stuff. But it's been a while since I've had them, and I can't remember what they taste like. But if I remember correctly, it's probably a very bland taste, similar to the artichoke. It's that. I'll use the word starchy.
Yeah. One thing they say about the sunchoke is that some people call it the diabetic's potato because it doesn't have those glucose sugars.
Yep.
You can eat them, which is also pretty interesting. I wonder if those Maximilian ones, probably they're also an inulin plant. It looks like they're very similar.
I would think I'd have to do some more research into it, but they're.
I did. Now that I read about it, because I did a really deep dive a year ago about these plants, and I remember hearing there are a few. I think there's even one other one that has tubers that are less common, but I think the sunchoke is just more prolific, and so it became the more common food crop.
Right.
That's really interesting. As far as cooking them, I've frying them up, mashed potatoes, putting them in stews. I've fried them and put them in tacos. They're really tasty. I still have a bunch in my refrigerator from last year because they're also super cool thing about them is that, when the plants die back, the big sunflower parts die back, I cut them off about 2 feet tall, and you just leave them in the garden, and that's where you store them all winter. You just pull them up when you need them. As long as the ground's not frozen, you can just pull them out.
Yep, and a side note to that too is that when you leave those stalks like that, you're providing wintering cover for a lot of our native pollinators. So they will overwinter in some of those stalks and stems and things along those lines. So,
oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense because you have the little hollow place now that you've left for them. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, that's great to know. I've been doing that for a few years and didn't realize how
See
beneficial that might be. Yeah, that's great. The one thing I was going to ask you, if you know, I meant to look this up, and I think I've looked before and couldn't find a good answer, is like the sunchoke basically propagates via the tubers. And I haven't really seen them like propagate via any kind of seed activity, but they still have flowers and they still, have nectar because the bees love them. So curious about like how that works with their seed.
I would think that the seed would have to do. It obviously plays some role in the reproduction of it. I know my seeds don't last very long because the goldfinches and things like that come in and just clean house. However, I do know that I have had some Maximilian sunflowers pop up 4 to 5 feet away from the bed where they're planted. So clearly that's not from a rhizome because, typically when you get those rhizome plants, the bed grows a little bit every year. It gets bigger and bigger. It doesn't just skip 5 or 6 feet. So my guess is that there was probably some seed that got dropped by a bird and started and picked up. So
that makes sense.
So
it seems like a plant. It's like less interested in its seeds, but it needs a little bit of that seed propagation. But it does a bit better.
Right. Well, don't forget they're perennials as well, right? So they build. A lot of their growth comes from their root base, not from the seeds like you do annuals and things along those lines. So
that makes sense. Yep. Let's get into the name Jerusalem artichoke because I find this super fascinating, and you might know some of these stories, but it's really interesting because, like I said in the beginning, it is not from Jerusalem, and it is not an artichoke. It is a sunflower native to North America. And so how did it get that name? The artichoke part is probably the easiest part to explain is during the journeys of Samuel de Champlain, the famous French explorer. He was up somewhere in Nova Scotia, and he saw them, and he said, they kind of taste like an artichoke. And that really stuck. I don't get the artichoke taste at all.
Yeah, that's a different... I mean, artichokes have I don't want to say they're bland, but it's...
but anyway, that apparently stuck because they're always called an artichoke.
Yeah.
And we call them sunchokes because I think people realized this Jerusalem part was confusing, and so they took the choke part and called them sunflowers, and sunchoke is the name that is kind of more common now. But the Jerusalem one, I had always heard first how this happened is that the story is that someone brought them back to Italy, and they started growing them in Italy, and then they ended up going to the UK where people spoke English, and there was a mispronunciation of the Italian word for sunflower, which is girasole. And the idea is that an English speaker said, "Oh, a girasole artichoke, a Jerusalem artichoke," and they didn't know what girasole was. And that's what I thought for years, and it makes a lot of sense.
It does.
But then I was reading that they started being called Jerusalem artichokes before sunflowers made it to Italy.
Oh.
And so the time frames don't work out. And I was like, wait, then why did they get this name? And the only other explanation is, and seems to be what people think is the case, is that the first place they really ended up in Europe was somewhere in the Netherlands where there was some botanist growing them. And he shipped them to some people in London. And he was from a town in the Netherlands called Terneuzen, which is TER space NEUSEN. And the theory is that people working in the docks didn't know the word Terneuzen, but if you put those together and think that the T looks like a J and you're, someone who only speaks English back in the 1700s or whatever, the word Jerusalem, you don't know the word Terneuzen, and they just started calling them Jerusalem artichokes, and it just caught on and spread, and they started being called that really quickly, which is really fascinating to me. The other interesting thing about them is their name, and they're either always called Jerusalem artichokes, or in French-speaking world, they're called topinambour is the name.
Okay.
And this is another name that is completely wrong.
Yeah.
Tupinambur is related to the name of an indigenous tribe in Brazil, which is nothing to do
Right.
with that. But apparently what happened in this case is that around the same time that sunchoke started to be sold at markets in France, a French explorer, colonialist guy brought a bunch of these native people from Brazil to Paris, and the people in the markets were trying to cash in on like this popular thing. It's kind of like, you know, a co-branding thing of
Yeah.
like marketing your product with something popular. And like everyone was really excited that there was these like native people in Paris, and they were the Tupinambur people, and they started just calling this other plant that's from somewhere over there, according to the Europeans, like, oh yeah, it's from the same place. They started calling them Tupinambur, and still to this day, that's what it's called in French, and a bunch of other languages are based off of that, and it's
Wow.
completely wrong.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I thought is super interesting about this is there are some plants that have like kept their native name, and we use those, but this is one that I was trying to figure out, like, well, what was it called? It's not a Jerusalem artichoke. It's not a topinambur. Like, what is the real name? And there's, as far as I can tell, if someone else out there knows some more stuff about this, I'd love to hear other like native names for it because I'm interested in that. But there is one reference. So Champlain is given credit as being the first European to eat them, but there is a reference to this guy named Thomas Harriot who was with Walter Raleigh, and he kind of didn't. He kind of like I have the quote here. He says there is a white kind of root about the bigness of a hen's eggs. And they're not so much cared for by us. So he basically like didn't like them, and so didn't get credit for understanding what they were. And that's before, about 40 years before Champlain. But they called them in this Algonquin speaking people around North Carolina, Kaishuk Pinauk, which is probably sun root, which makes a lot of sense.
Right.
So that's really interesting. That's kind of the really interesting story about this name of this plant, a plant that has all these names that are just all completely wrong.
Right.
And but yeah, an interesting history and something I really fascinated. And I love growing them. So thank you for introducing them to me.
No, that's it's funny when you start to look at some of these plants. I mean, the common names that we call them, and how incorrect some of the common names are.
Yeah.
And it made me look up Maximilian sunflower too, just to see what it is. And some of this it was named for the naturalist Prince Maximilian of Wied Neuwied, Germany, who led an expedition into the American West in the 1830s. So
interesting. So they're a little bit further west of a plant.
Yeah.
Sunchoke
So there's I'm gonna have to look up common names for skunk cabbage too, because I'm sure, like you said, there's the true names, there's the names we give them, and the stories behind that are kind of funny as to how they got to them. I mean, because I think a skunk cabbage, I'm assuming whoever discovered skunk cabbage. Yeah, I can't talk today. Whoever discovered skunk cabbage obviously must have had a run-in with a skunk. Otherwise, it would have, named it that. But it's just kind of interesting the histories behind all that, and kind of makes you, at least for me, anyways, wish that I had more time to dive into stuff like this. I'm an avid birder. I'm a trained wildlife biologist through education and some jobs and stuff like that, and you really get into some of this, and you start to look at it, and your list of favorite plants becomes longer and longer and longer.
Yeah, you're describing the whole reason I started this podcast, because I've been going down that journey and learning more about plants, and it's really, what I've discovered is, like, for me, every episode I have a new plant I need to talk about, and then I have to learn about it, and inevitably all these plants have something super fascinating. And then having someone else come on, like you, and talk about a plant, you learn something new, and it's a really nice excuse to spend, a few minutes with somebody talking about plants. So thanks for joining me.
I appreciate the opportunity.
And we're back here out in my garden again, and now I'm looking at my 3 honeybee colonies I have in my backyard. And I thought I would go get a little closer and take a look to see if I can see any pollen coming in. I think it's a little bit late for the skunk cabbage pollen, but bees are always bringing in pollen, and it's really cool if you get a chance to look at bees coming into a hive and looking at their legs as they fly in. They will often be full of pollen, and you'll see these two little lumps of pollen on their legs, and it's really cool to see the different colors coming in. And as Steve mentioned, you can often tell what kind of plant they've been visiting by the color of that pollen. Oh yeah, I just saw one fly right in. Legs full of pollen. Really cool. Let's see if we can maybe hear them. I'm going to put the microphone really close. Isn't that a great sound? Not everyone loves that sound, but beekeepers do. If you ever get the chance to hang out with a beekeeper, and a beekeeper lets you put on the whole beekeeping gear and open up a honeybee hive, one really cool thing to see is the pollen inside a honeycomb frame. Often bees will have entire frames that are where they're storing the pollen. So if you look at this frame of honeycomb, it'll be full of all these bright different colors of reds and oranges and yellows, filling up all of them. It's like a mosaic of beautiful colors. So Google that, or even better, hang out with a beekeeper, see if you can help out for a day, and see that it's a really cool thing to observe. And as we sign off for another episode of Rootbound, maybe we'll just let the bees buzz us out. Here we go. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Steve Rapaski. Steve is a master beekeeper based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You can learn more about Steve at his website, which is meadowsweetbees.com, and he's also on Instagram. Steve also stars in a short documentary I made a number of years ago called The Portrait of an Urban Beekeeper. You can Google it, or there'll be a link in the show notes. Rootbound is hosted by Steve Ellington, that's the other Steve. Music by Christian Kriegaskota. Fake ads by David Lani. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. But if you can go outside, may you have beautiful weather and no allergies.
Kick it rootbound.